Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
I want to welcome to the enemies list today an absolutely stellar American. It's Jenna Griswold. She is the Secretary of State of the great state of Colorado. And I want to say, I think there are a handful of unsung heroes in this country on the front lines of democracy. And secretaries of state in 2020 started to play a role that was much more central in this fight, in doing something we were accustomed to doing routinely as Americans before this era, and that was certifying that our elections were free and fair. And in America, they are free and fair. And Colorado is considered to have an excellent election system. So, Jenna Griswold, welcome to the enemies list. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Rick.
Well, I want to start out by asking you, tell me a little bit about where you see the electoral landscape, not so much from the head-to-head political equation, but how do you see the political landscape right now in terms of democracy as a whole, and of people having a respect for and a reverence for the system that we've used for 240 plus years now to elect our representative governments?
Gosh, that's a big question. So I do think Americans all across the country, Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliateds, are very concerned and very focused in on the state of democracy. We have seen several elections at this point, democracy being one of the biggest motivators. And one of the things I would point to is that in 2022, I was leading the Democratic Secretaries of State Association, and we had election denier Republican nominees running as the nominee in nearly every battleground state in the country, and we defeated every single one of them. So I do think that folks are very concerned about the state of democracy. I also think our democracy has been at code red for a while. Our institutions are not as strong as I think one would hope. The fight for democracy has been taken up by Trump and MAGA Republicans in a very twisted way to try to confuse and undermine. So it's a big issue going into this election. And, we've said over and over, this is the biggest election of our lifetimes, but this upcoming election absolutely is.
I think that's very much the case. And do you think, I'm seeing this, not only am I seeing it in polling, we've seen it, as you pointed out, in electoral results. People actually do care about democracy. They actually do. There is a sort of deeper appreciation that I think the political class gives that the issue of democracy and of preserving our system. I think the elite class sort of gave it short shrift for a while. I don't think they really understood it in the way that I think you do.
That's absolutely right. And I would add on, not only did some of the national pundits not understand how important democracy is to Americans, I think it's part of a bigger issue that a lot of the national pundits don't really know real Americans. I grew up on food stamps in a cabin with an outhouse outside in rural Colorado. My mom got her associate's degree when I was 5 or 6. My dad got his bachelor's degree when I was graduating from law school. So I grew up pretty blue collar. And I think there was, in 2020 and the 2022 conversations, an underestimating of the American people. Folks at the same time can be concerned about paying their bills and living paycheck to paycheck, while also being incredibly concerned that the basic fairness of what it means to be an American, what it means to live in this country, was at complete risk. So, one of the things that I really take optimism and hope from is that the American people are good people. They believe in fairness. And if they know what's on the line about the attacks on democracy, it's very motivating.
I think one of the things that you have done as a candidate that I thought was interesting is you've sort of poked a big hole in the idea of like the voter fraud stuff and the sort of fallacies that are out there by basically you track ballots, you've done things, you've made Colorado's electoral system you and I could nerd out much longer than this podcast on electoral systems because in Florida in 2000 we had a global embarrassment with our electoral system and Republicans and Democrats got together to reform it and we now run a very good it may be controlled by the Republicans right now, but it's a very good and well regarded and low fraud, low high trust system. Talk to us about what you've done. You've done 6 statewide election cycles now out there, or statewide elections out there. What is it you've done as Secretary of State that has improved Colorado's system because it is very well regarded?
Well, thank you. And believe it or not, at this point, I've overseen 10 statewide elections.
Sorry about that. My math in my brain was wrong.
No, it's okay. We've had statewide recount brought on by election deniers, and we just had our statewide primary last week. But thank you for the compliment. Colorado's election system is considered the nation's gold standard. It's considered the most accessible, the most secure. And the base of our election system is that we send a mail ballot to every registered voter, but then also have weeks of in person early voting, same day voter registration. And we see that not only does our system really drive up high security, folks are voting on paper ballots, it drives up high turnout. In 2020, we were #2 turnout state in the country. But on top of that, people have confidence in it. We are tied for #1 right now in the nation for confidence in our elections, which is something really important. And as Secretary of State, I've just continued to add on to this great system. So we've increased drop boxes significantly, more voting centers. I implemented automatic voter registration, which has led to over 620,000 new voters get registered, but also secures our systems even further. But on top of all the good things, and I could go on and on of how we're continuing to open up access, I've also really focused on the effects of election denialism. So I passed the nation's first law making it a felony to compromise voting equipment. I just led the nation's first law making it a felony to be a fake elector or to conspire to be a fake elector. We passed laws to protect election officials. So it's two sides of the same sword. We need to make sure that there's access and security, but we also need to realize that there are folks trying to undermine and disrupt our elections for political gain, and they should be disincentivized and held accountable if they do decide to go down that road.
So say more about that because we saw in 2020 we saw a national conspiracy. I'm going to use the word. You don't have to agree with that word, but I think we could say that led from the White House down to in multiple states with over 60 lawsuits, all of which folks, as you may know, were all unsuccessful on Donald Trump's part to overturn election results and to intimidate election workers and to engage in an effort to manipulate state officials as in Georgia into quote unquote finding him votes. And I don't want to bring this into just a Trump frame, but talk to us a little bit about your feelings on how that weaponized process of trying to invalidate and disrupt elections that are not close, that are not in real question, by using all these maneuvers and manipulations and things that range from intimidation to legal threats to physical threats. How does that affect the Americans' confidence in their systems and I want to praise you for doing that because I think that is something that was almost unthinkable in a lot of places before 2020.
That's right. So suddenly, overseeing elections is a lot more complicated because as election officials, we have to confront death threats ourselves. To give you an illustration, between September of last year to March, I received nearly 900 death threats or violent threats. We have to accept a new reality that folks are going to litigate. file as many things to gum up the bureaucracy of running elections as possible, and then also potentially try to breach security themselves. So, one thing Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans have been very successful at is the big lie and election denialism. And looking towards 2024, on one hand, we know what may be coming. On the other hand, the lies are so much more pervasive and mainstream than they were in 2020, which makes it all the more dangerous. So in Colorado, we have seen a lot of the threats to election workers up front. We've actually had a 38% turnover of elected county clerks since 2020. We've had two county clerks actually breach their own voting regulations, voting security protocols, trying to prove the big lie. I actually had to address the first insider threat in the country. And of course, we are always trying to get ahead of these major concerning efforts, which I think we have. If there is an issue, I will address it very quickly, swiftly, fairly, if possible, in a bipartisan way. I've also really focused on tightening the laws. So that includes prohibiting open carry near drop boxes, voting centers, or where they're processing ballots, making it a crime to threaten election workers, protecting whistleblowers in county clerk's offices if the county clerk themselves is up to no good. And just to be very clear, the vast majority of county clerks, election workers, are really good people and, regardless of party, do not like what's happening. We criminalized fake electors. We've done a whole host of things, just led a law on deep fakes. But it's like you're trying to hold a dam from bursting. And you're continually playing whack-a-mole, hoping that you're stopping enough of the bad efforts to get through to the other side. And ultimately, whether we get through to the other side will be determined November at the ballot box and potentially the lead up until January 6, 2025.
Yeah, I think that is going to be a moment where I always use a phrase that I'm fond of saying is an unpunished coup is a training exercise. And I think a lot of people on the right were not sufficiently deterred from, I mean, the foot soldiers perhaps, but the people that organized it and planned it, January 6th, they have not yet at that level reached the point of accountability. And I think I am profoundly concerned that as a country, we're not quite ready for the fact that even if Joe Biden blows Donald Trump out of the water, there are going to be millions of Americans who believe that the election was magically stolen and that violent action is a justifiable excuse for that.
I think that's a valid concern. We have seen the percentages of Americans on both sides of this question increasingly say that violence may be appropriate. And I think it's really important that every person of good conscience, every elected official, uh, draws a really clear line. And one of the things that is really frustrating to me is that folks in position of power, Senator Ted Cruz, Lauren Boebert, Congress people, governors, folks that Americans should be able to believe, their rhetoric and lies has such a huge effect. And ultimately, the lies and disinformation about our elections is what incites this really bad behavior. It's what actually incites security breaches to elections, Republicans and Democratic election officials getting threatened. Uh, so I think it's really important to continually stand up and call out the misleading of the American people by extreme elected officials. I will say I am optimistic that we will get through the other side of this. But it's a really concerning spot to be in. And I agree with you. The lack of accountability is just mind boggling. We just saw the Supreme Court issue its case today on presidential immunity, which will gum up that trial even further. We've seen the Supreme Court decide. I was party to the 14th Amendment case, which argued that Donald Trump should not even be a candidate because of his role in insurrection. We are seeing the legal system at the very top not really provide swift enough accountability for people who tried to steal an election from the American people. So there isn't that disincentive like it should be. And I agree with you. Some of the cases are really important for people who were at January 6th. I think some of the prosecutions we see happening in the state, including the state of Colorado, against the county clerk, Tina Peters, who compromised her own voting equipment, is really important. And we need to highlight cases like that so bad actors know that if they commit a felony, well, they're going to be charged with a felony and potentially serve that in jail.
I believe felony convictions are an actual thing that might change some behavior out there. I think Steve Bannon's about to learn that lesson starting this afternoon. But you mentioned the 14th Amendment case in Colorado, and full disclosure, Mario Nicolais, friend of mine, attorney of mine, and it was one of the folks that helped fight that out. What were your feelings about how that? I mean, I wasn't shocked that this Supreme Court decided the way it did. But what did it feel like to be bringing a case that was so consequential? Because, I mean, we just don't have presidents who are engaged in that kind of disqualifying behavior as a general rule.
That's right. So it was a relatively untested area of the law, or not recently tested, we can say.
Luckily, we didn't have to.
Well, exactly, because presidents usually accept if they lose or win an election, which is something that's part of American political tradition that is going to the wayside. So this case was actually brought by Republican and unaffiliated voters who filed a lawsuit against me saying that under the Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, Donald Trump was ineligible because he engaged in insurrection. It went to the trial court. Trial court determined after a week bench trial that he engaged in insurrection, then went to the Colorado Supreme Court. And the Colorado Supreme Court looked at all the facts again and said, yes, he engaged in insurrection. And because of that, he's disqualified as a candidate. Ultimately, I think the Colorado Supreme Court got it right, both in their decision, but also in telling me to put Trump on the ballot as long as the litigation was still moving. Because we got up to the United States Supreme Court, and I'm there with you. I just did not have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court that they would do anything that would hinder Trump in any way, ultimately. So I wasn't surprised by the outcome. I think if anything was surprising about the case is that the United States Supreme Court did not even get into the question of whether he engaged in insurrection.
Right.
In oral arguments, the only conversation about insurrection, if I'm remembering correctly, was from Alito, who said, well, heck, insurrection is so hard to define. How would we ever define that? Which is a little flabbergasting given it's, the United States Supreme Court. They're in the business of defining terms. They got out of the case on, I wouldn't call it a technicality, but said never said Trump didn't engage in insurrection. They never said the state of Colorado acted incorrectly. What they said was Congress had to act first before a state could disqualify a federal candidate for engaging in insurrection. And we know with this Congress, that's very unlikely to happen.
I think that's right. And look, we have a fundamentally divided country. I think in one of the most vital areas that a country should be unified on, and that's the rule of law. I mean, and really what you were looking at in that case, what Colorado was looking at in that case, was that the rule of law is respecting the rule of law is deeply wired into the country, or should be. But now we have, a candidate on the ballot in the form of Donald Trump, who anything that's against him in the legal space is rigged. It's a con. It's a scam. It's a fake news item. And I worry that has infected things down into the system more broadly, and left people a lot more skeptical and disheartened uh, about things like voting, about things like, will people be held accountable when they commit actual crimes that cause meaningful harm to folks. I think it is a very it's a very dark place in a lot of ways right now in the country, that we have this anti-democratic, and I mean, folks, that with the small d, um, movement around America that has become so impassioned.
I agree. And part of spreading so many lies is so that it's really hard for Americans to know who's telling the truth and who's telling the lie. And to reach the point of, well, maybe there is no truth, maybe there is no fact. Um, and that's not only incorrect, it's a really dangerous place to be. So I think, moving into this election cycle, not to be a further Debbie Downer, there's another layer on top of all the misinformation and the far right trying to distort what is fact, what is the truth, and that's the emergence of AI technology and deepfakes. We've been under this just wave of disinformation, starting from Russia and our foreign adversaries, China to a smaller extent, Iran, that was domesticated in 2020. But ultimately, one of the tactics of pushing back on disinformation is to alert Americans that they're subject to disinformation and go to a trusted source. But with deepfakes and AI, we have to go a step further. We have to alert Americans what you see and what you hear may not be true, because the manipulations are getting really, really believable with deepfake audio and video. So I think, we have seen states really lean in. I led a law on deepfakes, political deepfakes of candidates or elected officials at the state level this legislative session in Colorado, and we were state number 7 to pass a law. But we really need the federal government on stuff like this to get its act together. And unfortunately, we have a Congress that just is beyond ineffective. And it's really troubling. And I don't know if this deluge of deep fakes, where suddenly you can't quite believe maybe what you're seeing with your own eyes as you're scrolling through social media, whether that's going to happen this election or next election, but it's something I think is another layer of concern for American elections and democracy.
In 2018, I had a friend of mine in Silicon Valley, give me an understanding, and I make television ads for a living. I understand that there's a lot of great technology, and he said, by the end, he goes, in 20, it's going to be still pretty crude. He goes, but by the end of the 2024 election cycle, you will be unable to tell, and trained professionals will be unable to tell, in 90% of cases, whether something's real, whether that alleged aside that someone says off camera with the N word in it or something else is real or fake. And it will happen so quickly and be of such high quality that social media will take off and run with it, and it'll be very hard to ever catch up. And by the time you end up getting one of them resolved, the next one will hit, and the next and the next and the next. So, I mean, that disinformation mechanism in our society, it is a very impenetrable problem as far as I'm concerned right now. I don't see a lot of solutions that the majority of Americans would have confidence in yet. But I do think that we benefit when we get out of our media silos a bit, and we benefit when we're not focused simply on social media, because there's no cross-checking, no verification. Look, I say this to people all the time. A strong press really is one of the most important things that can help validate or invalidate that disinformation.
Absolutely. And with deepfakes, we're going to have to give the press a little bit of room to also get it wrong. So I think it's going to be a matter of time when folks, the press is trying to get stuff out so quickly that they don't catch high level deepfakes, and we need to give them the ability to come back and say we were wrong. And I think that will be really good for the country. You know, You and I are talking a lot about the major concerns of where we are as a country. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of major concerns. I never would have imagined running for Secretary of State in 2018 that we would have been where we are today, just 6 years later. Um, but with that said, I will say, with all these threats and concerns, there are a lot of glimmers of hope. When we're talking about the disinformation, we are seeing the far right really gleam onto that. And it's a big problem that there's 170 election deniers in the Hall of Congress. It's a big problem that US senators didn't stand up when they had a glimmer of having a spine post January 6th to say, you know what, American presidents can't steal presidencies with insurrections. But even for, how far we've seen the big lie go, election denialism go, extremism go, a couple of things that really gives me hope are all the good Republicans all across this country. I'll give you an example. So, for example, we had the first public insider threat. Tina Peters, county clerk, is running around with Mike Lindell, compromised her own voting equipment, trying to prove the big lie. I decertified all the voting equipment, worked with the Republican county commissioners to remove her from oversight, and then asked my 2018 Republican opponent, the former Republican Secretary of State, to step in to oversee the election. And he said yes. There's good, the majority of county clerks in Colorado are Republican. They do a great job, and they would never do anything to jeopardize our elections. And beyond that, there are such great people on both sides of the aisle, and we just have to sometimes agree to the facts and disagree to the policy. That's okay. That's how this country should work. But also remember, the American people are good people too. And even though we're facing this existential threat to democracy once again, Donald Trump and the far right have continually lost since 2018. And so I think, it's just the balancing act. Folks shouldn't feel such despair that they also decide, hey, I'm going to sit this election out. Because the real power in this country is the power of the people at the polls. And the American people across party line have all the ability to save our elections and our democracy and the future of our nation in November.
It really is. I mean, this is when I see people despairing, oh, Biden had a bad debate, or whatever their despair point is. Americans did not feel like they were going to beat Donald Trump in 2020, and they beat him. Millions and millions of Americans came out and they said, we've had enough of this. We're not going to do this anymore. And that is one of the things about America that is always so providential, is that to use the old Churchill trope, we do the wrong thing until we do the right thing in this country. And I think being engaged in elections is one of the most important things people can do. And look, I do, outside of Lincoln Project, I am on the board of Vote Riders. We do help people get voter IDs in states, help them get their legal ID that they need. And it's a mission that, gets people, a lot of people who'd never been involved in politics before, they suddenly go, oh wait, I can vote. And they are empowered in ways that go way beyond voting. But I do think that this country needs to have a deeply serious conversation about more civics education, more involvement of people, getting folks in the fight in ways that they sometimes don't even imagine they can be in the fight. So, Jenna, I want to salute you for the great work you're doing in Colorado. I'm going to be out in your state in a couple weeks. We're going to come out to Aspen for a few days for some meetings, and
oh, nice.
I'm looking forward to that. And my sister lives out in Thornton, right outside of Denver. So I'm
good.
Headed out that way shortly. So I wish you all the best. Tell folks where they can reach you on social media.
Well, first off, Rick, thanks for having me, and thank you for all of your work. And again, I think the work you all have done at the Lincoln Project and through other avenues just shows that this isn't a fight Democrats versus Republicans. This is a fight Americans versus those who want to destabilize the country. So thank you for everything. And folks can find me across platforms just at Jenna Griswold, JenaGriswold. And I'm looking forward to a great election here in Colorado. And I hope you have a beautiful trip up to Aspen into seeing Colorado.
Thanks so much. All right. Jenna, thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right, folks, I am coming to you on Monday after the great debate. The great debate, which caused millions of elite media, well, not millions, but a couple hundred, millions of elite media and various political activists and various Obama alumni and various Dean Phillips campaign managers and various other and sundry weak-kneed, vacillating chicken shits to run for the hills and scream, we're doomed, we're doomed, we're doomed, we're doomed. Biden can never win. Guess what, guys? It sucked. It was a shit debate. It was awful. It was absolutely a train wreck of the highest fucking order. But you know who you're helping with the panic? Donald Trump. You know who you're helping with this fantasy land bullshit underpants gnome Aaron Sorkin's circle jerk belief that you can magically replace Joe Biden? Donald Trump. You know who you're letting, if you believe this theory that he must get out, you're not going to have a nominee until late in August. You know how that helps? Donald Trump. Suck it up, deal with it, strap on. It's a war. You fight it as you fight it. You don't get to fight it in the terms and conditions you want. You fight the war on the terrain that exists, not the terrain you believe would be nice to fight on. Get your shit together, get off the enemies list, because we've got Donald Trump's ass to kick. That's it.